The In-Between Place, a Creepy Conceptions original. Artwork by Kanarushi. Every summer, my parents would take me and my brother to spend a few weeks at my grandparents' house. I used to love going there. I grew up in a major metropolitan area, and I looked forward to enjoying a summer breeze that was cooler, a green that was brighter, skies that were clearer, and nights where city lights didn't hide the stars. I used to think my grandparents' house was massive, at least compared to my middle-class suburban childhood home. It was an early 1900s ranch-style home with a circular driveway, white with red brick steps leading up to the front door and in between the two columns that supported the attic above the second-floor balcony. It was a quarter mile to the main road and another half mile to the closest neighbor. It was as country as I had ever experienced up to that point. I looked forward to going there every year until I was 7 years old. That summer, everything changed. I remember bouncing excitedly in my seat as my mother carefully parked her SUV in the driveway. The car had barely stopped when I hopped out of my seat, racing down the side of the house along the grass before she could even take the keys out of the ignition. As I rounded the corner, I saw my grandmother squatting in her herb garden, cutting some of the plants with a pair of scissors and gathering them in her gloved hands. She wore a red Hawaiian shirt with her faded overalls. Her characteristic sun hat and obnoxiously lime green gardening boots sat near the shed, indicating that she was simply there to gather some ingredients for her delicious cooking rather than doing actual gardening work. She wrapped whatever she was cutting and placed it into her gardening basket. A gardening trug, she called it, and I thought she was calling it a gardening truck for a good majority of my childhood. She looked up to the sounds of my excited screeches, smiling as she saw me barreling towards her. She stood and walked to the wooden door that she kept closed at all times to keep the pesky deer out, barely having time to open it before I collided into her, almost knocking her over. She picked me up and swung me around before putting me back down, putting her hand on the small of her back. "You're getting heavy," she exclaimed. "What do you weigh, 200 pounds?" I giggled. "No, I weigh 55 pounds. She looked at me like she wasn't quite convinced. "Maybe you should check your scale." I offered to carry the basket, which I saw had a few tomatoes, different types of herbs, and some of the yellow squashes that were shaped like flying saucers. She indulged me as I talked about a mile a minute on topics that I now realized must have been rather uninteresting for her, but she acted interested as we made our way to the sliding glass doors that led into the kitchen. I saw my grandfather smiling happily as he knelt, reintroducing himself to my 3-year-old brother, Dustin, who hid shyly behind my father's leg. He wore the same ugly shirts Grandma wore, which I could now see was covered in red and pink flamingos. My brother wasn't normally shy, but he usually took a couple of minutes to adjust to the booming voice of my grandfather. "Never smoked a day in my life," he would always say. Dustin soon gave in, breaking into a goofy smile as he allowed Grandpa to hoist him into the air. I put the vegetables on the counter, jumping up and down near my tower of a grandfather until he turned his attention to me. He positioned Dustin on one arm before scooping me up in the other, swinging the both of us around and making comments on my weight. I was on the lanky side growing up, so I was quick to correct anyone who said I needed to put more meat on my bones, proudly proclaiming that the doctor had told me my weight was perfect for my age and height that year. I giggled some more as Grandpa put me down, telling me I probably weighed about as much as an elephant. I heard the stern voice of my mother call to me as she came down the wide hallway that led from the front door. "Forgetting someone?" she'd said, and I had the decency to feel guilty as she set a small black carrier on the floor. I quickly walked over, apologizing to the small blue eyes that cautiously peered out at me as I opened the door. I think he must have been about 7 or 8 months old at the time. As my mom had told me before we left our house, I allowed the proof of age to walk out on his own so that he would be more comfortable with the new surroundings. He did this rather quickly, and I scooped him up into a quick, apologetic hug. Aw, I'm sorry, Fuzz. Fuzz, I heard my grandparents say in perfect unison. Short for Mr. Fuzztastic, my father explained. She picked the name. It was true. I had asked for either a cat or a dog for my 7th birthday, or really any pet. My parents had sat me down, telling me this could be a very good exercise in responsibility, and that caring for another creature was very important. But before I could practice showing responsibility for a puppy, I would have to show responsibility in other areas of my life, like the daily chores that I hated doing, or always having to finish all of my homework before being able to play outside. It felt like eons. It probably wasn't. But after finishing every assignment before asking to go play, brushing my teeth after dinner before being asked, picking up my toys, and making my bed as soon as I woke up in the morning, I finally saw all of my hard work pay off. I laugh now. It was unbelievable that I thought a worksheet of addition problems and copying vocabulary words onto a piece of paper was hard work. A week before my 7th birthday, my parents told me that we could go to the local shelter to pick up a puppy. I was ecstatic. I bought a leash and collar with my allowance money, checked out a book on dog training at the school library, and found the pages to local veterinarian offices, like the book had told me to, ripping them out and sticking them on the fridge. My mom said we couldn't really buy a bed yet since we would have to get one that would fit the adult dog, and we weren't sure what size dog it was going to be. I told my mom I found some vegetarians and put them on the fridge, and she struggled to work out what I meant for a solid 3 minutes before breaking down into hysterical laughter. As luck would have it, my mom's coworker had a cat who had recently had a litter, and the person who was taking the last kitten suddenly backed out. I came home from school the day before my birthday to see a small ball of fluff with bright blue eyes greet me. I immediately fell in love. His color reminded me of my grandmother's favorite pearl jewelry set, and he tilted his head at me curiously. His nose, ears, and the tips of his paws were dusted gray. As he got older, the gray spread to the rest of his face. For reasons I still don't understand, he was considered a blue point rag doll. I didn't get it. He looked gray. I used the dog training techniques on him anyways, with rather astounding success. It was the greatest lesson in patience I ever had to date. In fact, I think it helped me out of the situation I found myself in not long after. As we all got settled, I reluctantly got the litter box out of the trunk of my mother's car and set it up in my bathroom. I had my mother's old room, Dustin had my aunt's room, and my parents shared the guest bed. I hated the litter box, choosing instead to walk Mr. Fantastic unless I was at school, but my mom forced me to bring it with us anyways, just in case. The adults got to work in the kitchen. It was one of their traditional things to do together as soon as we got here. They would all pitch in and help cook a huge dinner for everyone. Later on, my mom would tell me it was how she first realized Dad was the one, since he was so willing to participate. I would often join Grandma or Grandpa in the kitchen on the later days, but they knew that I would be too excited with what I considered to be the great outdoors and the animals to force me to stay indoors. With Fuzz on a leash, I toured around the property. The house was close enough to the center of town that, as they grew older, my grandparents had been able to donate most of their farm animals, opting instead for weekly trips to the local market. I was upset to find that the last dwarf cow was gone. A few dozen or so white and brown hens still clucked and kicked up dirt in a large fenced-in area. A half a dozen black and white ducks waddled among them, jumping in and out of a tiny oasis my grandfather had built for them. Some of the birds would allow me to pet them, but I was told not to bother the ones in the coop. Still, my grandparents asked me to wait before introducing any of them to Fuzz. I took Fuzz around the vegetable garden, taking care not to allow him too close to the tomatoes that grew around a skinny, metal upside down cone. My grandparents' two great Pyrenees dogs were lying near the birds. I wanted to pet them and introduce them to Fuzz, but the birds were out, meaning the dogs were working, even though, to me, they just looked bored. Fuzz had met the large orange cat, who seemed rather uninterested in him. With so little animals to play with, I wound up taking Fuzz out into the field with my fanny pack filled with cat treats and doing heel drills and figure eights. Dinner was served, and my grandfather told a story for me and Dustin in the family room before we went to bed. I was annoyed at Dustin for interrupting so that he could ask questions, but I sat quietly as my grandfather patiently explained the word mystery after telling Dustin that a detective is a person who solves mysteries. I was up bright and early the following morning. I helped my grandfather feed the birds and put out fresh drinking water. Then, while they were distracted, I donned gloves and helped collect the eggs. Grandma and I made pancakes together. Back then, I used to think I wanted to live closer to the countryside. I would go to school and be an animal doctor for farm animals. I would be around them all the time. For some reason I can't quite remember, my aunt, my mom's sister, couldn't bring her family at the same time as us that year, so I would have to wait until the third week to have cousins to play with. They would get to spend the whole summer here after that, but as much as I begged them to let me stay, my parents refused to allow me the same privilege. I still had a blast on that first week. The barn that sat about halfway between the house and a tree line that marked the end of my grandparents' property was now filled with very exciting recreational vehicles, and I spent my days riding dirt bikes, ATVs, swimming in the lake, fishing with Dad, and climbing trees. I walked around with my legs covered in bandages. I helped Grandma tend to the garden, and I even got to ride a big horse by myself. My grandparents' neighborhood didn't have many kids, and though I got to play with a boy that visited down the street a couple of times, kids in my age range were almost non existent. I couldn't wait until my cousins got there. Robbie, 11, and Josh, 8, were my aunt's sons on my mother's side, and when we were together, the backyard became our very own world of make believe. But for now, while my grandparents had their afternoon reading time, my dad took his turn at fixing dinner, and Mom fell asleep in Dustin's bed as he played with his favorite toy, a big school bus. I found myself once again doing figure eights with Fuzz in the backyard. I took him next to the chicken run and made him keep his eyes on me and ignore the birds. It seemed impossible the first day I tried it, but as the second week came to a close, he was doing rather well. One day, I sat on the grass, staring out into the edge of the forest while Fuzz played with a small pink ball that seemed to be his favorite toy. I wasn't allowed to go into the forest alone, and if all three of us, my cousins and I, were together, we still had to be close enough to see the house between the trees. Sometimes Robbie, Josh, and I would play out there, but our parents usually distracted us with other activities. I didn't really like going in there. The forest didn't seem ominous or creepy to me or anything, just dull, still, sad. I guess, in my 7-year-old mind, I equated this feeling to boredom. Still, I never disobeyed any orders not to go in there, or any forest for that matter, alone. When I asked why, I was told that sometimes kids get lost, sometimes they get found, sometimes they don't. I didn't really understand the implications of this, but I stayed out of the forest unless I was with both my cousins or an adult. Robbie had a BB gun that he got when he was 10, and he always carried it with him. I think our parents had a false sense of security because of it, and that's why they let us go just beyond the tree line when we were all together. They didn't have to tell Robbie to take the gun. He never left home without it when we were out here. If they had only known what was really in there, they would know it wouldn't have mattered. It was the weekend before my cousins were set to arrive, in the summer before second grade, that I found out exactly what it was. That single event brought all my earlier musings of moving out to the countryside crashing down. I'm in my 30s now, and I, like my parents, own a house in the suburbs of an upper middle class neighborhood. My grandparents sold their lovely ranch and moved to a retirement community in Florida, and I fortunately have not had to be within 100 miles of that forest since. I was circling the perimeter of my grandparents' property, just inside the wooden split rail fence marking it. My grandparents were doing their afternoon reading. Mom was cooking, and Dad was probably asleep on Dustin's bed as he played on the floor with that same school bus. I couldn't wait until Dustin was old enough to actually follow my very creative and imaginative style of play. But for now, I could only tolerate so much of it until I got tired of pulling out paper to draw exactly what I meant, and then explaining why it was there. Why couldn't we step on this imaginary line? Because the line is where the moat is, and the moat is filled with alligators, sharks, piranhas, and leeches. What's a moat? Why does it have to have all those things? Is a piranha just a baby shark then? Why can't I pretend I have a boat to get across? But why is it not as fun? It's easier. I would rather have spent hours explaining trivial things than to have gone through what I experienced that summer. Maybe, just maybe, if you get lost in the woods, this will provide you the way out. I had kept Fuzz on a leash any time I was outside. He was pretty good most of the time, especially since I had more time with him since school was out. But he was still a kitten, and I didn't want him running off where I couldn't see him. That's why, when I saw him dash toward the tree line, knowing for certain that he should have been in the house, I was initially confused. Crap, I thought. Dustin had probably opened the door to let him out, and he had come to me like he always did, only to see something in the distance and give chase. My first reaction was panic. Fuzz! I yelled, immediately crawling through the gaps in the wooden fence. I thought I saw him dash up ahead and ran after him. Fuzz! I came to a stop just a few yards past the tree line. I shouldn't be in here, I thought. But Fuzz... No, I decided. I wasn't supposed to be in the woods. Mom and Dad had walked me through this. If Fuzz ever got lost, come back and get them, and then go looking for him with his food and toys. He would probably come back anyways, and I would have more control over the young kitten if I had his goodies and a leash. Reluctantly, I turned around to jog back toward the house, only to see more forest. I was immediately disoriented. This didn't make sense. I had just crossed the tree line by a few yards. I should still be in clear view of the property. But I looked all around me and there was just forest in both directions. No house in sight. I started to panic, tears stinging at my eyes. This didn't make sense. This just didn't make sense. Okay, calm down, I told myself in the same way I had talked to myself when I had first started training Fuzz and would stomp away, huffing. I took a deep breath. I didn't have time to count to 10. Just retrace your steps. I pointed in the direction I thought I was facing when I had first come in and walked backwards. Silly, I know, but what else was I going to do? I kept walking like that, no sign of Fuzz anywhere, hoping against hope, praying, when I felt myself stumble over some roots and fall back against a thick tree. The trees here were different, I thought. I was obviously no tree expert, but the trees here seemed to have greater variety. There was also less foliage and no green. The trees seemed more spaced apart, not closer together to make the forest thicker, and there weren't any animals in sight. I panicked. I turned quickly in the direction I thought I had come from and ran as fast as I could. I ran and ran and ran. There was just more forest, more woods, more dead leaves on the ground, thick trees, skinny trees with some sort of mist all the way at the top. I couldn't see the canopy. I kept running. I don't know how long I ran for before I collapsed against a very thick tree, sobbing my eyes out. I had never felt so alone. I wanted to wake up. This had to be a nightmare. I could usually will myself awake from bad dreams. Not this time. I don't know how long I sat there for. It seemed like forever and no time at all at the same time, long enough for my sobs to turn to sniffles. I took stock of my surroundings as calmly as I could. Dad always said that the first thing you need to do when you get lost is find shelter. I looked at the large tree behind me and noticed that there was a small crevice right at its base. I knelt down and crawled into it. The tree itself had a trunk about as wide as the one in the center of our shopping mall, with many large branches very low on the trunk. I couldn't see any leaves on it, like the leaves were somehow too high. The crevice had a slight turn to it that would completely protect me from the elements my dad had talked about. It was big enough for me to lie down in if I turned my body into a C shape. I had a thought. If it's rained, should I stay in here and risk the lightning? I crawled back out from my spot. I couldn't just stay here. I had to find my way back to my grandparents' house. Yet, looking around, I knew I had no idea where I was. Maybe if I stayed here, they would find me. I knew they would be looking for me, and now I had a shelter. The next on the list would be water. But this place was empty, foreign, desolate. I hoped my family would find me soon. I tried not to cry again. I was still on my hands and knees when I saw that the area around me had turned darker. I supposed night was approaching. How long had I been out here? Just then, I heard a shuffling from an area on the other side of the tree. I stood up and, in a crouching position, quietly peered around. About 50 yards away was the silhouette of a man and his dog. They seemed to be looking for something, the dog sniffing around in the air. I suddenly felt relief. A real adult, I could ask him for help. But before I started to move forward, a sudden feeling of absolute dread washed over me. I was terrified. I didn't know why. The man looked normal as far as I could tell, and there was nothing noticeably alarming about him. Still, I found myself backing up slowly and quietly into my newfound shelter, squeezing myself into the crevice as far as I could go to the point where I could not see outside the tree. It was quiet. I was quiet. I couldn't explain the sudden fear that took hold of me. My parents had told me that there are bad people in the world, people who like to hurt others. They told me that I couldn't always trust every adult. They told me to never let anyone convince me to do something that I wouldn't want to tell them about. But my feelings right now had nothing to do with that or with what I had been taught. It was something else entirely. I sat with my arms around my knees for a long time, fearing the man outside. I'm not sure how long I was there. It felt like forever and no time at the same time. I prayed. I prayed that my family would find me. I prayed that I would be protected. I desperately wanted to hear them call my name. The tree itself had this damp coldness about it. This whole forest seemed cold, empty, hollow. Not cold like ice cream, just a different kind of cold, something I couldn't explain. It was like the gaze of a statue at the museum. I didn't sleep. I didn't feel sleepy. I felt both tired and not. I cried a bit more, as quietly as I could. By the time I had gathered the courage to peek out of my hiding spot, I realized that it was daylight once more, or what passed as daylight in this forest. I guess I must have been here all night. It felt like a year and a minute at the same time. I wasn't sure if I was thirsty or not, but I knew I had to find water. Maybe I could mark the trees so that I could trace my steps back to this shelter once I came across a stream or a lake. I started to crawl out from under the tree and froze. About 20 feet in front of me stood a teenaged boy, tall and husky, in a dirty white t-shirt and brown shorts. I was overjoyed. This time, there were no immediate feelings of dread. He looked lost too, but I was happy not to be alone in here. Maybe we could get out of here together. I moved forward a bit more and began to stand up, preparing to call out to him, when someone from behind me put one hand over my mouth and another around my chest, pulling me back with immense strength. I was terrified to my core and wanted to scream. I tried to take their hand off me, but just before I was about to start biting down, I heard them speak quietly and quickly into my ear. "I promise I'll tell you how to get out of the forest, but you have to be quiet until he leaves." The tears now leaking from my eyes rolled down onto their hand. "You can't make a sound." I nodded, and the hand let go. I immediately turned around to see a rather normal-looking little girl, about 5 or 6 years old. Light brown hair, green eyes, and a faded blue dress with white polka dots that looked so dirty that it was as if a dog had somehow dug it up from a yard somewhere and then given it to her as a present. It was filthy. The girl herself, however, looked significantly less muddy. I had no idea how she'd gotten there. Maybe there was another hole on the side of the tree that I hadn't seen. Impossible, I thought. Still, that was the only way my brain could come to terms with the fact that she had gotten into the crevice while I was at its entrance. I could barely squeeze through it myself. I held my hands over my mouth as I heard the sounds of the boy walking around us. He was really close now. I could hear him. I was shaking. I felt the girl put an arm around my shoulders, seemingly trying to comfort me. Somehow, it worked, and we stayed like that for a while. I looked at her a couple of times. I could barely see her in the lighting, but she just looked on ahead. She didn't look scared at all. Actually, she looked very bored. It wasn't long before I checked the area immediately outside the shelter. Nothing. I got out and walked around once, looking in all directions, before I got back in and squeezed around the curve as closely to the little girl as I could. She looked oddly familiar. Very familiar. I was sure I had seen her before. Did she go to my same school? Maybe I had seen her at the fair or played with her one day at the park. I didn't know where, but I had definitely seen her face before. "He's gone," I told her. "No one is here." She nodded. "Good," she said. The forest was eerily quiet, empty, hollow. but it was also searching, lost, wanting. I sat in front of the girl. For some reason, even though she was younger than me, she gave me instant comfort. I fought this comfort, knowing that the only two other people I had seen in this forest had been people I obviously couldn't trust. But what choice did I have? I had walked an entire day and not been able to find my way back. I didn't know how I got here. I had long stopped worrying about my cat, knowing that his cat instincts would probably help him find his way home a lot better than mine were. I tried not to start crying again, focusing instead on the young face in front of me. "How did you get here?" she asked. "I don't know. I was at my grandparents' house and I saw my cat run into the woods. I ran in after him, but then I turned around to get my parents, since I'm not supposed to go in there alone. I only ran into the woods for a second, but I got lost. I don't know how." She nodded. "Listen to me. You didn't see your cat run in here. It was a trick to lead you through the door." "Door?" I asked. I hadn't seen a door. "It's not a door you can see. It's invisible, but when you walk through it, it brings you here," she explained. "And where is here?" I asked. "It's an in-between place. It's like someone made a space between two floors of a building and you got dropped in." "Did that boy drop in too?" "Did you?" "Yes," she stated. "But our doors are closed. You can still get out the same way you came, but we can't." "So, you're stuck here?" "Not exactly. We just have to accept we can't go through the same door. Some kids, like that boy, don't know they have to go through the other door. They don't know or can't accept or can't understand that they have to go through a different door." I was beginning to become more and more scared. I listened intently, but as she spoke, I noticed there was something off about this girl. There was something off about her face. I allowed silent tears to escape down my cheeks. The girl patiently waited, and I tried desperately to keep quiet. I was afraid of who might be out there. How was I going to find my door? I had walked for hours through this forest. It all looked the same everywhere. This forest, with its dead gray leaves, its canopy that both was foggy but wasn't, and its mismatched trees. I was able to calm down a bit. All the while, she continued to look at me patiently. She looked bored. How do I get out of here? How do I find my door?" "I'll tell you, but there are a few rules you absolutely have to follow 100% of the time. If you don't, you won't be able to get out." "Okay, what are they?" "I would follow any rule to get out of this nightmare and back to my grandparents' house. I would never, ever set foot in another forest ever again when I did. The first rule is the most important. Never say your name out loud in here. Ever. Even if you think you are by yourself, because you might not be. Any name that anyone calls you, even nicknames, don't tell anyone your name. Don't even say it, because your name is how you will find your door. Consider it like a map, and if you say your name out loud, it will echo through the forest and ink out the map. If someone asks you your name, even if they seem friendly, don't tell them." That was weird and terrifying. I didn't understand it, but I quickly nodded. I definitely would not say my name out loud. Second rule: whatever you do, don't fall asleep. Never ever fall asleep. Never fall asleep? But what if I get tired? The girl shook her head. "You won't. Time doesn't go the same here as it does out there. It is both bigger and smaller. You won't get tired. You won't need to eat or drink. You won't go to the bathroom. I suddenly realized that I had been here an entire night and hadn't felt even the slightest urge to use the restroom. What she had said was true. I promised her immediately that I would do none of those things, especially sleep. And third, never show emotions. My heart sank. How was I going to do that? I had never been more scared in my life. Hearing her say that almost made me burst into tears. Why? My voice trembled. Because it will show that your door is still open. The other kids, like that boy, will follow you and go in front of you and try to slip in through your door. Once they do that, your door will close and you won't be able to get back. I felt my lip tremble. How was I going to do this? That seems really hard. It is hard, but you can do it. Once you walk around in this forest for long enough, you will be too tired to be sad. You will have cried too much. The new feelings of fear will be gone, and you won't have any sad left. This usually happens around the same time your door closes. But remember, time isn't the same here. But people can tell you're new by your emotions, your running, your excitement, your fear. Even if someone comes up to you and tries to talk to you, don't trust them. Ignore them. Just keep walking. Don't even really look at them. The kids who have been here long enough will sometimes ignore you, but they still watch to see how you act. Some, like that boy from before, haven't been here for long enough after their doors closed. They can't accept it. They'll try to go through yours. I know they can't, really. They can't go back to your grandparents' house, but then you can't either. Tears ran down my cheeks. She continued, in order to find your door, you have to keep walking, slowly, aimlessly, mostly in a straight line. No emotion, no excitement, no happiness, no sadness. If you see another kid, pretend you didn't. If they talk to you, ignore them. If they scream at you, don't act surprised. They are testing you. Keep walking. Eventually, you'll start hearing your name being called. Now here's the tricky part. You can't turn and walk immediately toward your door. You can't let anyone know you actually hear your name being called. As you walk, shift your walk in that direction, as little as you can, and keep walking straight. Eventually, it will get louder and should be right in front of you. Keep walking towards it and you will be able to go through it, but this can either take a long time or very little. You don't actually know how far you are. This is why, as hard as it may be, if your name sounds right behind you, keep walking forward. If you turn around, you don't know how far you have to walk, and a lost kid may see it and run in that direction and shut your door. Keep walking forward and, every once in a while, shift one way or the other, but not enough for anyone to tell you are purposely shifting. This place is kind of circular. The space here is weird, so you'll eventually hear your name again, but don't ever stop walking. Ever. You have to keep going. You are the only kid here with their door open. There is always only one at a time. Your door is closed, right? She nodded. It suddenly dawned on me what was so wrong about her face. It was expressionless. The complete and utter lack of strong emotional response. A sadness that was too tired. A fear too spent. When she spoke, when she looked at me, no matter what she did, she looked bored. Her face and her voice were completely flat. But if her door was closed, then... If you told me not to trust anyone, How do I know I can trust you? Maybe you are wanting to be the one that goes through my door. How do I know you're not? Because you know me, she stated simply. I did. I didn't know where from, but I did. And I know that you can only go back through a door when the world beyond it still makes sense. Time is different here. I'm still a kid, but look at how we are dressed. We are not from the same time or place. My world doesn't exist anymore. That's why my door is closed. Going back wouldn't make sense. She was right. Her dress looked very weird to me, and it was very different from my shorts, t-shirt, and sneakers. Will you be able to find your other door? I asked. Are you stuck here? I'm not stuck. Like I said, time is different here, and I knew you were here. I know you, and I knew I would find you. I want you to get back because you are the only one that can give a message to my family. I don't want to go on without knowing I did what I could to send them this message. I also knew you would be here, and because we know each other, I needed to help you. How do we know each other? She shook her head. You'll understand once you make it through. You'll know. I can't tell you here, and I don't have to. I was hopelessly confused, but I didn't press further. How will I find your family? You'll know once you make it through. I promise, you'll know. I know you're confused, but trust me, you'll know. Is that why you stayed? How did you know I would come? You have always been here, but in some ways, you just got here. I knew you were here, but here, time stretches, bends, molds, squashes. It's different. It's hard to explain. You won't understand that when you get back either, but you'll know enough to send a message. I nodded. What's the message? Tell my family that they can find me now. To come look for me and they will find me this time. That didn't make any sense to me. Either this girl was crazy or I was. But I did know her, and I had to trust her. I had to do what she said or I would never get back. If you say that I'll know how to find your family and give them this message, then that is exactly what I'll say to them. She nodded. There is one more thing. Whenever it is night, you must come back to this tree and hide. But if I keep constantly walking, how will I find it again? The forest bends its shape too, and it's not a very big space. It repeats itself. When you see it start getting dark, you should have enough time to hide. As long as you stay still, they won't find you. Stay quiet. Are you talking about the man and his dog? Yes, the night man. He is looking for someone. Once he sees you, he will think you are his kid. When he realizes you're not, he'll sing you a lullaby and you'll fall asleep. So you have to hide, but don't sleep. You can't sleep. What happens to kids who fall asleep? I asked. If you fall asleep here, you die. I think back on it now, and only some pure evolutionary determination for survival that was probably written in the genetic code of humanity long before I was born was what was keeping me semi-calm during that whole conversation. I had never been more terrified up until that point, and to date, I have never been more terrified for myself. I wanted to cry and scream. I wanted my mom and dad. I wanted to go home. I wanted to wake up in my bed and forget this nightmare. But the will to survive gave me courage to continue. This entire thing seemed insane. Walk through the forest, look bored, show no emotion, follow my name, and don't stop walking until I get back. How will I know when I've walked through my door? You'll be back home, she said simply. I wonder what she looked like when she smiled. She was probably very pretty, and her dress was probably pretty. I had a love for her I couldn't place. I'd like to think she had it for me, even though she was probably tired of the love emotion too. I felt sad for her. At least now she can go through the other door that has opened for her. If I can't make it, how will I find my other door? You'll make it. I believe in you. Take however long you need to gather your courage, but don't take so long that your emotions fade too much. If they start to fade, your door could close at any moment. And definitely don't do the things I told you not to do. There is a reason I got stuck here. Did you try to go through another kid's door? She shook her head. It makes no sense, and my family told me about the place that I will go to next before I got here. I'm okay with that. I just needed to get you home, and I wanted you to take my message. I looked around the corner toward the crevice. When I looked back, she was gone. I squeezed myself into the back of my hiding spot and cried a fresh new set of tears as quietly as I could. I began to doubt myself, and I prayed, asking God for courage. I would have to go out there, but I had never been more terrified in my life. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be stuck here forever. I wanted that girl to come back. I tried to think of how I knew her, but I couldn't remember. It was just beyond the edges of my mind. I don't know how long I sat in my corner, but I cried for long enough that I got tired of crying. I almost panicked, thinking that maybe my emotions were fading, and I decided that this was it. I had been practicing keeping a straight face for what seemed like an hour in creepy forest time. I pretended I was trying to get Fuzz to do a new trick, or to explain how to play Go Fish to Dustin. I pretended I was doing addition problems. My heart was thundering in my chest. Some kids are still soft. Some will be angry. Some will beg and plead. Some will touch you or try to pull you. Others will scream at you. Don't react. Whatever you do, keep a straight face until they move from in front of you. Then keep walking. This will be the hardest thing, but you need to do it if you want to get back to your family. Don't let your face show your feelings and you will be safe from them. I have to do this, I thought. I took a deep breath and peered around the corner of the crevice. It was daylight, or, well, it was not night. Just do it, I thought. Like pulling a baby tooth with dental floss, like jumping into a lake from the swinging rope, like going down a huge water slide. Do it. I got up and started walking. At first, I was terrified, and I kept doing math problems in my head to distract my mind. Then, I just thought of my family. I walked and walked and walked. It both got easier and didn't at the same time. I walked for lifetimes, or maybe for 5 minutes. I wasn't sure. I hadn't heard anything. I was still scared. The place was ominous. Maybe I could get used to ominous. The silence was foreboding. This place was full of danger, especially for me. I was the only child with an open door. My fear quadrupled when I saw the first kid out of the corner of my eye. I almost glanced their way, but I caught myself and kept walking. I could see them stop and look in my direction, tracking my movements. I felt tears swell into my eyes. Look bored, I thought. 37 plus 17. 7 plus 7 is 14. 30 plus 10 is 40. 40 plus 14 is 54. 37 plus 17 is 54. 50 minus 13. 50 minus 3 is 47. 47 minus 10 is 37. 50 minus 13 is 37. I found that focusing on these equations helped me keep my face from showing any other emotions and took my thoughts away from my fears. I could no longer see anyone around me. I didn't see the other girl again. Some kids definitely had a stronger presence than others. Some would just be walking aimlessly. I almost turned and ran when I saw a young boy about my age walking almost directly toward me. I barely kept it together, but the math problems were working well to distract and calm me. I think he wouldn't have noticed if I had thrown myself at him, bawling. He just kept walking, staring straight ahead, dress shoes dull, button sleeves that were probably once a lighter color, almost as brown as his vest with dirt. The girl had been right. Most kids were like this. I didn't know whether I had walked for 5 minutes or 5 years, but I was starting to get bored, starting to get used to the forest. The kids who worried me were the ones with strong enough presence to actually walk towards me, watching me closely, studying me. I was getting used to seeing the kids, but I still had to try to remember a good memory, or remember what a place or thing looked like if I had only seen it once. I even tried to play movies exactly in my head, but only the boring parts. I tried to remember what I had for lunch the last day of school. I tried to remember the birthday of everyone I knew. I was adding numbers with 3 digits and subtracting 2 digit numbers from 3 digit numbers. Then I saw the teenaged boy I had seen after my first night here. I felt him before I saw him. I was instantly scared. He jogged toward me and started walking beside me, bending down slightly to get a closer look at my face. "Hello?" he asked. He waved a hand in front of my face. 258 minus 44. He moved to stand directly in front of me, placing his hands on my shoulders and leaning down. He scrutinized me closely, his eyes searching every inch of my face. 214. I stared somewhat past him, imagining that I was watching my dad play golf with his friends, or my mom try on outfits with her friend while I sat on the chair near the fitting room, bored out of my skull. His energy was so strong, and it was desperate. I was glad to have had practice up to this point. I was getting good at math. I would have no problems next school year. 352 plus 296. Suddenly, he let out a scream directly into my face. Had he not looked up into the glitched out canopy at that moment, he would have undoubtedly noticed me give a tiny jump, my eyes widening. I quickly returned my face to neutral position, paying special attention to relax my eyebrows. I had forgotten the numbers. He continued to look directly at me, screaming. His face showed no anger, no fear, no worry. He simply opened his mouth. In fact, he looked as if he were singing the most boring song ever. His emotions, however, came through clearly in his voice, and I found myself forgetting how to add in the single digits, let alone 3 digits. I held fast. I didn't flinch. "Think statue," I told myself. "You need to go home. You can see your family. You can see Fuzz. Just be a statue." I suddenly felt a solitary tear develop at the corner of my eye. Oh no, please, no. But it was too late. The lonely tear traveled down my cheek, seemingly flushing out my hopes of returning home. He seemed not to notice. I kept my face straight, the tear the only sign of my inner feelings, but my face itself, its shape, never changed. Maybe they weren't able to see the other changes. Maybe they were only able to see frowns, smiles, or wide eyes. I almost jumped again when the boy's own face changed, only for a split second. But it changed. He looked different then. He looked terrifying. I thought he looked like a zombie at the time, or honestly, a really ugly zombie. His face was blue and black and green, falling apart with tiny white worms crawling around it. I was glad I couldn't eat here because I would have vomited immediately. and the boy would have seen that I was the kid he was looking for, the kid with the open door. The instant was brief, and the boy sat on the hard, cold ground, his head in his hands. He cried. I stood stoically in front of him. He eventually looked up at me and, seeing that I hadn't moved, scooted over to the side to let me pass. I kept walking, relieved beyond measure. I walked and walked and walked. The nightman came and went twice. Each time, I was able to seek shelter under the tree until he left. I was almost losing hope, and I was beginning to think this was some sort of ploy to get through my door when I heard it. It was faint, like a whisper. It sounded like a shout from a very far away place. It was coming from an area to the right of me. I was excited, but I tried not to make it obvious as I shifted ever so slightly in the direction of the sound over a series of steps. I didn't run. I couldn't. I wanted to, badly. I wanted to sprint in the direction of the voices. They were somehow getting louder without actually being loud. They sounded closer, but the actual strength of the sound was the same. It is hard to explain. It sounded like an orb of sound that was getting closer to me. It was still just slightly right as I hid once more from the nightman. The following day, I began walking the same way, ever so slightly straightening my path until I was heading straight toward the sound. The orb seemed to be maybe half a football field in front of me, and I hated the stretchiness of this place because I continued to walk and walk and walk. A boy followed me for a while, studying me. The orb was closer, and I hated the fact that he was walking in front of me for a while. I almost changed direction away from the calls, but he ran off, deciding I wasn't the one kid he could be looking for. I wondered if other kids had other helper kids who had told them about the doors and how to find them. Kids who knew and had accepted their doors were closed, but who still wanted to help another and send a message to their family and friends. I walked forever and for no time at all. I had just stepped out from the tree after talking to the girl. I had just seen Fuzz run in, chasing after him. I had seen all the children at the same time. I was there for almost no time at all. Yet, I was there for several lifetimes. I worried I would never see my family again. 10 yards away. Please God, please God, please God. Some other kids came in between me and the shouting orb. It scared me, but soon I felt myself approach it. I felt it without actually feeling it. It was so close that it was right at my chest. Then I passed it. Hot. I'm hot. Very sleepy. Did I fall asleep? Oh no, maybe the nightman got me. But I was so tired. I was too tired to care. I still heard the calls, but I wanted to sleep. I wanted so badly to sleep. I think I heard a dog barking. I heard shrill shrieks. I heard a loud engine or thunder or a volcanic eruption. I remember I mixed vinegar and baking soda with red food coloring to make a volcano once in science class. I looked to the side and saw the girl. She had come towards me, and she proceeded to lie down on her side, head on her hands. She smiled. I thought I felt the ground shake. People were running. There was a soft blanket, thick, heavy, but I was hot. My throat hurt. A silent church bell reverberated through my head. The world had a dark, spinning cloud around it. The girl mouthed the word to me, and I repeated it. It was a name. Her name. Then she closed her eyes and fell asleep. I did the same. I woke up to the sound of an alarm. I guess I was on my bed. A woman in a white outfit came in and started messing with something next to me. A head lifted from my bed to my left. A hand was holding mine. "Sorry to wake you," the woman said. "I just need to switch out the fluids." The head to the left belonged to my mom. She rubbed sleep out of her eyes as she sat up. I tried to reach for her with the hand she wasn't holding, but it was tied to some sort of board. "Mom?" I croaked. My mouth was dry, almost pasty. "April?" She looked at me, confused but hopeful. "Where am I?" Suddenly, her face turned red and her eyes filled with tears. She quickly hugged me. "Oh, April, you're safe. You're safe now, honey. Charlie, wake up. April is awake." I saw my dad pop up from behind her. I found out later that there was a pull-out couch and that my parents had been sleeping in the hospital room with me since they had found me. I was soon overjoyed to be with them once more, but right then, I felt exhausted. Every muscle ached. I haven't felt that exhausted since. My arms and legs felt like they weighed 500 pounds each. I begged for water and was given a wet sponge to suck on while the doctor was called. It sounds gross, but to me, nothing had ever felt or tasted as good as that sponge. The doctor came and evaluated me, but I was too tired to do much that day. I rested, and the following day, I felt a lot better. I learned that I had been found in a national park about 20 miles north of my grandparents' house, in a heavily wooded area. It was early morning on the fourth day of my disappearance. I was barely conscious. The people that found me, volunteers from a nearby town, quickly took off most of my wet clothes and wrapped me in a blanket. A teen boy among them ran as fast as he could to the sheriff's office. The sheriff called the police department of my grandparents' town, who got in touch with medical personnel that instructed them to mark a landing zone in a nearby field. I was airlifted to the nearest pediatric center. Even though it was summer, there had been a soft rain the night prior, and my soaked clothing had led to severe hypothermia. They told me I was okay back then, when I was 7, but when I was older, my parents admitted to me that any longer and I wouldn't have made it. My temperature was normalized and I was given nutrients, fluids, and electrolytes through an IV. I was tested for infections but didn't have any. I had a high level of acid in my muscles, like I had run a triathlon. I was severely dehydrated, and they were afraid that I would have something called rhabdomyolysis, where the muscles start to break down. But I didn't, thankfully. For the next day and a half, I would float in and out of consciousness, barely recognizing the people in front of me, speaking incoherently, and asking where the nightman was. I didn't want the nightman to get me if I fell asleep, apparently. My mom told me it was okay to sleep. The nightman was gone, and I was safe. When I woke up on the second afternoon, my mom saw the lucidity in my eyes. She knew I was back. The doctor evaluated my coordination, my memories, and I impressed everyone by easily adding 3-digit numbers in my head, something I hadn't practiced yet. I wobbled a bit when I went to the restroom, and I had to take a sponge bath. On the third day, I was walking easily, sitting up, and listening to my cousin Robbie read me a children's book, while my aunt took Dustin and Josh to the playroom. I walked up and down the hallways easily, but I didn't want to walk much. On the fourth day, the detectives came. They had told my parents that the sooner I was interviewed, the better, so that they could catch whoever the nightman was. They didn't want my memories compromised, but my parents were afraid they were too late. They said that I hadn't been making any sense when they asked where I was, or how I got where I was. I told them everything that happened. I remembered it all clearly. I told them that I had chased Fuzz, but that I had only run in a few yards, stopping almost immediately. Then, suddenly, I was in a completely different forest. I described it as a type of in-between place like the girl had said. I told them who the Nightman was and told them several times that the Nightman had never seen me or spoken to me. The Nightman never touched me. The detective said this was consistent with my examination. It hadn't shown any signs of an assault or a struggle. It was more like I had not only starved for 3 days, but been running the entire time as well. I told them about the little girl who had helped me. I told them what she told me to do. I described the forest in detail. I described the trees. A forest like that didn't exist. An expert brought in a large picture book based on a description of some of the tree trunks, and I pointed out the trunks. She said that many of the trees I described were nowhere near the place where I was found or any area around my grandparents' house. She also said that many of the trees were not tall enough to be so tall as to not be able to see any branches or the top. I confirmed that I saw no branches except on the one tree, on which I also saw no leaves or even the ends of the branches. It's like they were distorted, but when I was there, the distortion made sense, and my brain understood it. I saw no animals or other plants. I heard no birds. I saw many other kids. I was asked to describe them, but said I didn't look at many of them. I described the girl and the teen boy. I told them about his zombie face with worms crawling in and out of holes on his cheeks. I described the Nightman. I saw no buildings. The weather never changed. There were maybe 7 or so nights. They showed me pictures of men and asked if any of them looked like the Nightman. None of them did. What did the Nightman look like? He was scary, but he didn't look scary. He looked like a normal guy with a normal dog. He was looking for his kid. He was wearing white socks on the outside of his pants and his clothes were clean. His hat was a weird shape. It looked like a normal hat that someone smushed and ironed. He didn't speak. I only saw him once. On the 5th day, I was discharged. I went to my grandparents' house but refused to go outside. Even to my grandma's garden, I refused to exit the back doors of the house. I had expressed dismay that, even though the girl in the forest had told me I would know how to get the message to her family, I didn't. I couldn't remember her name or who she was. I told them she knew me and was waiting for me there. They asked if she was a guardian angel. I told them no, she wasn't. She was a girl, an actual girl wearing a really dirty dress, a little younger than me, with brown hair and green eyes. She wanted me to tell her family to look again. They continued to search the area where I was found because of this, thinking there might be another kid. I told them I thought she was dead since she had gone to sleep. It wasn't until I was flipping through an old photo album that I found the answers I was looking for. The adults were gathered in the family room when I burst in, holding the album open and running towards my grandmother. "That's her. That's the girl who helped me." I handed the album to my grandma and barely registered her dropping her tea to the floor next to her. "That's your big sister, right, Grandma?" She said nothing, continuing to stare at the black and white photograph of a young girl wearing what looked like a gray dress, smiling brightly. She had her arms around another girl in front of her that I knew to be my grandmother. Her sister, Agatha, had been missing since she was 6 years old. She disappeared and was never found. My grandmother was 5 years old. They were best friends, she'd said, and she still missed her. She used to draw their memories so that she would never forget her, and she told me many stories from their youth. My grandfather came up behind my grandmother, looking over her shoulder as my aunt and uncle helped each other clean up the spilled tea. For a moment, everyone was too stunned to say anything. "Agatha?" my grandfather inquired. My grandmother glanced between me and the photo in her hands, her expression blank and unreadable. as if her emotions were struggling to play catch up. It was Agatha, but that's not what the girl had said to me when I went through the door. She told me her name was Aggie. My grandmother suddenly gasped, dropping the album to her lap and bringing her hands to her face in shock. Aggie, she repeated, her voice trembling. I sat beside my grandmother on the couch and put an arm around her just like Aggie had done to me underneath the tree. I'm sorry I made you cry, Grandma, but I promised Aggie I would tell her family something. And since we're her family, that means all of us. She said to come looking for her again. She said that you can find her now. She said she knew me, and that she waited to find me so she could help me get back before going through the other door and leaving the in-between place. My grandmother was shaking. April, dear, can you... can you tell me what her dress looked like? What she was wearing? I know now that this was information she knew I wouldn't have learned from anyone in the past, yet I answered her easily. She was wearing a blue dress with white polka dots, but it was really dirty. She grabbed the album and flipped ahead, showing me a different photo of the entire family, with Aggie in the middle. She wore a short dress with white polka dots. The photo was black and white, but the style looked the same. Was this the one? She asked. I think so, I said after looking at it for a few moments. It was really dirty, but the style looks the same. My grandmother smiled through her tears. That was her favorite dress. We returned home the following day, cutting our vacation short since I was no longer comfortable being so near the forest. To this day, I have an aversion to any significant grouping of trees, no matter the size. I was taken to counselors following the incident, and I excelled at mathematics for the rest of my academic career. However, I chose a career in child psychology, helping children overcome trauma. These children were the ones who truly needed guidance. I had always had a warm and loving family before and after the incident, and I wanted to extend that to the children who didn't, if only for a moment. Even little Aggie watched over me while I slipped into the in-between place. I will never understand what that place meant, but I knew it was real. Some people believe me, some people don't. As for Aggie's message, a quick search of the area where she had disappeared several hundred miles from my grandparents' house revealed the skeletal remains of a small child. They were unable to determine the cause of death, but they were able to use DNA from her bone marrow to confirm that she was a genetic match to my grandmother, making it highly likely that they were siblings. I knew what happened now. She slipped in, and she was unable to get back. But she stayed. She stayed to help me. Even after all of her emotions died within her, her goal remained. She made sure I was safe. She watched me cross, and then she entered the second door. She moved on. I know I would be stuck there without her help. She helped me. I frowned. I blamed the forest, and I will always hate them. It wasn't an accidental slip into an alternate, in-between dimension. It was deliberate. It was a call, a misdirection, a lie that I ran into blindly, a lie created by a man who couldn't cope with the disappearance of his own child. I've searched for the Nightman, who I know now to have been from the colonial era based on the way he was dressed. A man that lost his child and then disappeared himself. I found many cases of missing persons, but solid information was scarce for anything that early. I decided not to have children of my own. I'd be too afraid of them one day asking me to go hiking. I would never be able to handle it. Please, keep your children away from forests. I had someone watching over me. Some kids make it back with simple, blind luck. Others get trapped and wander aimlessly until they fall asleep. They can't go back, and they can't move on. The point is, most kids don't come back. If you love them, keep them away from forests. You never know where these doors to the in between place could be hiding. That concludes our story for today. Thank you so very much for tuning in. I truly hope you enjoyed listening. If you wish to submit a prompt request, you can send me an email at stories@creepyconceptions.com. Now, there are some things I won't do, and you can find those restrictions on my page. Other than that, I always welcome any challenge. Please submit any requests for brilliant artwork to commissions@kanarushi-studios.com. She is a mastermind of all things creepy and otherwise. You can find both of these emails on my page and linked in the description down below. Till next time, stay creepy, my lovelies.